The glass walls of the downtown hotel caught the morning light and fractured it into cold, blinding shards that stretched across the executive lounge. Below, the city was already awake, cars flowing like veins of metal, people rushing toward meetings that mattered to them. Inside, Adrian Vale stood utterly still, staring at his laptop screen as if sheer willpower might force it to change. Nothing happened. The cursor blinked at him, slow and indifferent. Adrian's fingers tightened around the edge of the marble table. He refreshed the folder again, then once more, his movements growing sharper, less controlled. The presentation should have been there. It had been there the night before. 68 slides refined over 6 months, revised through countless sleepless nights, carrying forecasts, acquisitions, and promises that would either crown his legacy or dismantle it in front of a room full of powerful people. Gone. His jaw flexed. He opened the backup directory, empty. He checked the cloud storage, no connection. The Wi-Fi symbol flickered weakly in the corner of the screen, as if mocking him. He searched his email, his external drives, every place muscle memory guided him, but the result never changed. Adrian Vale did not panic. That was what people said about him. That he was unshakable, surgical, always 5 steps ahead. But right now, something cold and unfamiliar crept into his chest. In 45 minutes, he would be standing before investors whose combined net worth could buy and sell the city beneath them. Without that presentation, his words would mean nothing. He exhaled slowly and straightened his cuffs, an old habit meant to restore control. The memory of the taxi ride flashed through his mind, him checking emails on his phone, the driver rushing through traffic, the USB drive pulled out to review one last slide. He couldn't remember putting it back. The realization hit like a silent blow. The lounge door opened with a soft click, and Adrian barely noticed at first. He was too busy running a recovery scan, watching the progress bar crawl forward at a tortoise pace. A service cart rolled in quietly, its wheels barely whispering against the carpet. "Good morning, sir." The voice was gentle, careful not to intrude. Adrian glanced up reflexively. A young waitress stood there, her uniform crisp, posture straight. She looked tired in the way people did when they worked early mornings, but her eyes were alert, curious without being nosy. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes," Adrian said automatically, then added, "black." She poured it smoothly, setting the cup down beside his laptop. The aroma rose, rich and grounding, but he didn't touch it. His gaze snapped back to the screen when the scan finished. No files found. His shoulders dropped a fraction, the smallest surrender. He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly aware of the faint stubble along his jaw, the ache behind his eyes. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours. The waitress lingered for a second longer than necessary, not staring, just noticing. She saw the rigid way he stood, the tension in his neck, the speed with which he reopened folders as if afraid they might vanish again. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Is something wrong?" Adrian almost dismissed her. He had no time for conversation, no patience for sympathy. But the words caught in his throat. Perhaps it was the neutrality of her tone, or the fact that she hadn't offered empty reassurance. "I've lost something important," he said at last. She nodded, accepting that answer without pushing. "Would you like more coffee?" "No." He paused, then surprised himself by continuing. "I've lost a presentation. One that determines whether my company survives the next year." The truth sat between them, heavy and unpolished. The waitress's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in shock but understanding. "I'm sorry," she said simply. She turned to leave, then hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the cart. "If you don't mind me asking," she said, choosing her words carefully, "what kind of file is it?" Adrian looked at her, really looked this time. Her name tag read Lena. He should have brushed her off. Instead, he answered, "A financial presentation. Slides. Charts. Data models." Lena glanced at the laptop screen, then back at him. "And it was there earlier?" "Yes. Last night. Did you close it normally?" "I think so." She bit her lip, thinking. Sometimes programs auto-save copies without telling you. Especially if the system crashes or loses connection. Adrian felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt all morning. Hope, faint and dangerous. "I've already checked," he said. "Recovery tools, temp folders." "Nothing." Lena nodded again, unoffended. "May I look?" The request hung in the air. Adrian hesitated. She was a waitress. He didn't know her background, her skills. But he also didn't have a single viable option left. Pride had no place here. 5 minutes, he said, pushing the laptop toward her. "That's all I can spare." Lena smiled faintly and pulled a chair closer. She didn't rush. She sat down, adjusted the screen angle, and placed her hands on the keyboard as if greeting an old friend. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, opening menus Adrian hadn't touched, navigating system paths he barely recognized. She asked him a few short questions: what software he used, whether the file name had special characters, if he'd ever edited it on another device. Her voice was calm, her tone focused. Adrian answered automatically, watching her with growing surprise. This wasn't guesswork. This was familiarity. She checked hidden directories, system caches, backup logs. When something didn't work, she didn't frown or sigh. She simply moved on, trying another route. The minutes ticked by, loud in Adrian's head. Then Lena paused. She leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in frustration but concentration. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a slim, slightly scratched laptop. It looked old, but carefully maintained. I carry this with me, she said, almost apologetically. For studying. Studying what? Adrian asked. Computer science, she replied. Part-time. She powered it on, connecting it to his laptop with a small cable. Adrian felt his heart begin to race again, but this time with something like cautious optimism. I think your file may have partially synced before the connection dropped, Lena said. If so, fragments could still exist. Adrian swallowed. And if you're wrong? She met his eyes. Then we lose nothing. Her fingers moved again, faster now, code scrolling across her screen. Adrian leaned closer, barely breathing. For the first time since morning, the future felt uncertain in a different way, not doomed, but suspended, balanced on the quiet competence of a woman he'd met less than 10 minutes ago. Lena's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. The hum of the lounge seemed to fade into the background while lines of code filled her screen, white text sliding over a dark surface in steady rhythms. Adrian stood so close he could see his own reflection faintly mirrored in the glass of her laptop, his expression tense, eyes fixed on every movement of her hands. This may take a few minutes, Lena said quietly. The file looks fragmented. Adrian nodded, though his mind barely registered the words. He checked his watch without meaning to, 28 minutes until the boardroom doors closed. He had never cut anything this close in his life. His entire career had been built on preparation, redundancy, layers of safety nets. Now all of that power was reduced to waiting. Lena opened a directory filled with temporary system files, many of them named in random strings of letters and numbers. To Adrian, they all looked meaningless. To her, they were a map. She sorted them by time, then by size, scanning the list with trained eyes. Every so often she paused, muttered something under her breath, and tried a different filter. Here, she said softly. Adrian leaned in. On her screen was a file with a corrupted name, the extension incomplete. It was larger than the rest. That could be it, he asked, his voice unsteady. It could be part of it, Lena replied. Presentations are usually stored in segments when they auto-save. If enough pieces survived, we can rebuild it. She copied the file, then another, and another, assembling them in a separate folder like pieces of a broken mirror. Her laptop worked harder now, the fan whirring softly. Adrian realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to exhale. As Lena ran the recovery process, memories pressed in uninvited. Adrian thought of the first time he'd stood in a room like the one waiting for him upstairs, younger then, hungrier, with nothing but borrowed confidence and a half-baked idea. He had promised himself he would never be at the mercy of chance again. And yet here he was. The progress bar appeared. 5%. 10. Adrian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Another vibration followed. Still, he didn't move. Nothing mattered more than the thin blue line inching forward on Lena's screen. At 30%, the laptop froze. Adrian's heart slammed against his ribs. Is that? Shish, Lena said gently, one hand already moving to adjust the settings. It's just recalculating. She closed one program, freed memory, then restarted the process from a checkpoint. The bar reappeared, slower now but moving. 45%. Why are you working here? Adrian asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Lena didn't look up. Because bills don't wait, she said. And degrees take time. 60%. A faint image flashed on the screen, one of his slides, distorted but recognizable. A chart, the same one he'd agonized over last week, adjusting the curve by decimals that would matter to people who understood what they were looking at. Adrian felt his throat tighten. It's there, Lena said, a hint of relief in her voice. We're getting it back. 75%. The lounge door opened and closed somewhere behind them. Footsteps passed. The world continued, indifferent to the quiet crisis unfolding at this table. When the progress bar finally reached 100%, Lena didn't celebrate. She immediately opened the recovered file, scanning through it with critical focus. Slide after slide appeared, text blocks intact, charts whole, notes restored. She tested transitions, clicked through animations, checking for corruption. Last slide, Adrian said, barely audible. Lena scrolled. There it was. The final projection, the one that justified everything before it. Clean, sharp, whole. She saved the file, then saved it again in 3 different locations, on his laptop, on her own, and onto a temporary drive she created on the spot. It should open normally now, she said, finally leaning back. For a moment, Adrian couldn't move. The tension drained out of him all at once, leaving behind something like disbelief. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and laughed, a short, quiet sound that surprised them both. You did it, he said. Lena smiled, small and genuine. You had most of it already. I just helped it find its way back. Adrian closed the laptop carefully, as if it were fragile glass. He straightened, suddenly aware again of who he was supposed to be, but changed by the last half hour. You just saved a company with over 12,000 employees, he said. And a deal worth more than some countries' GDP. Lena stood as well, a hint of nervousness returning to her posture. I'm glad I could help. He looked at her, really looked, at the confidence she carried so quietly, at the intelligence she never advertised. People like her, he realized, were invisible to men like him until moments like this forced their worlds to intersect. Come with me, he said impulsively. Her eyes widened. Sir. To the boardroom, he clarified. You should see what you saved. She shook her head quickly. I can't. I'm working. Adrian smiled. So am I. Minutes later, Adrian stood in front of the board, the lights dimmed, the recovered presentation glowing on the screen behind him. His voice was steady, his arguments sharp. But every time he advanced a slide, he felt a quiet awareness of how close it had all come to vanishing. The room responded exactly as he'd hoped. Nods. Notes. Murmured agreement. When he reached the final slide, the silence was the good kind, the kind that meant they were convinced. The deal passed. By evening, the city outside the hotel windows was washed in gold. Adrian returned to the lounge, scanning for a familiar face. When Lena appeared, he rose from his seat. He didn't thank her again. He didn't need to. Instead, he offered her a future she hadn't asked for but had earned, training, opportunity, a place where her skills would no longer be hidden behind a service cart. As Lena looked down at the card in her hand, Adrian understood something he'd forgotten in his climb to the top. Sometimes the most powerful people in the room weren't the ones at the table, but the ones quietly keeping everything from falling apart.